Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the event of Klímapolitikai Institute. Today's guest is Mr. Benji Backer, founding president, founding chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, as well as author of this book called The Conservative Environmentalist. Benji Backer, thank you very much for being here with us today. And before beginning the moderated discussion, I would like to let you know that you can also ask your questions using our Slido, using the code on the screen. And at the end of the discussion, I will read some of those to Benji. So first, I would like to know what motivated you to start the American Conservation Coalition, which is among the largest environmental organizations in the USA, and probably the largest one on the conservative side. What motivated you to start that organization, and what enabled the organization to expand so rapidly, to grow so rapidly, and have tens of thousands of members by now?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Good evening, everybody. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here. I've had a great few days in Budapest. Most of my trips in the United States, I'm there for about 24 hours or less, but here I've been able to spend 4 wonderful days, and I want to thank the host team right here. That's been amazing. I've been able to see the countryside. I've been able to see the Opera House and do a walking tour through Budapest, and it's just a beautiful, lovely place. And I would like to just say that America is finally back, and that we are not only back, but we are going to continue strengthening the relationship with Hungary. And hopefully this is just one example of me being here, but I know our president-elect and our congressional leaders are all dedicated to strengthening the relationship with this beautiful country. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I actually think we planned this before the election, so it has nothing to do with them winning, but I know that things even look brighter now. I started being involved in American politics when I was 10 years old. If you remember John McCain and Barack Obama, they ran against each other in 2008. When they were debating on stage, my parents were independent voters, which is rare, right? It's a small percentage of people in the United States. We have a very tribal, team-based politics. But my parents were independent voters. They were watching the debate, and John McCain reminded me of my grandpa because he was well, first of all, he was old, but also he was a Marine, and my grandpa was a Marine, and they wanted to fight for an America that had strength at the global scale, but also was able to help the lowest income peoples reach the American dream. And that's something through capitalism and innovation and American ingenuity that I thought could be possible. And so I got inspired to start knocking doors for him. My voice hadn't even changed yet, and I had a buzz cut, and I was chubby, and I was just a little kid knocking on doors for candidates, specifically John McCain. And fast forward to high school, I was on Fox News for the first time when I was a freshman in high school. So I was 14 years old. I spoke at CPAC later that year. And I was really active in conservative politics, obviously, but I also had this other love that I think we all hopefully share in this room, which is a love of nature, a love of the planet that we've been given, a love of the environment. And in America, I felt like my love of the environment was at odds with my political leanings. I was conservative, and I was watching them on TV say that climate change isn't real, and the environment, is just a resource for us, and that we should, drill, baby, drill, right? And I'm pro oil and gas, but when you just only kind of emphasize the energy and the economy, and you don't emphasize the environment, that didn't really speak to me. So my freshman year of college, I logged on to Twitter, also known as X now, thanks to Elon, and I tweeted out, I'm going to start a conservative environmental organization. And the reason why I did that was obviously because of what I just described, but also there was nothing that existed. All the environmental organizations in America are pretty left of center. They're pretty liberal. And it's become an arm of the Democratic Party, really. $10 billion every year, $10 billion US dollars gets spent by environmental organizations in the United States. NGOs, $10 billion. So a lot of money. There's zero on the right until our organization became a thing. We don't have $10 billion yet. But we are fighting for a different approach to environmentalism, but also with the hope to make it a nonpartisan issue in America again. Because Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, these are Republican presidents, they led the biggest environmental achievements in American history. And I believe that the conservative movement must return to its roots of conservation, to embrace environmentalism, and to lead it into a better future. And so that's why I started ACC. That's why I wrote the book, because there wasn't a book written, similar to that there wasn't an organization. And now we sit here 8 years later after starting ACC, American Conservation Coalition, not MCC, ACC, and we have almost 100,000 members across the country. We have about 40 full-time staff, and we are really prevalent in the Republican circles, and right now I'm helping Donald Trump write his environmental agenda with his allies.
Making environmentalism a bipartisan or a non-partisan issue, that's an interesting thought that recurs in your book many times. But you also, charge a part of the political right with skepticism towards climate change, and a part of the political left with despair and alarmism. So I would like to know how divided the American society is around the topic of climate change, and which group is more numerous. So there are more people, more middle-way people who are more perceptive of your thoughts, or there are more people at the extremes, at the skeptic and the despaired ends of the political thoughts on climate change.
Yeah, well, first let me ask the people in this room, by a show of hands, who here considers themselves an environmentalist, by a raise of hands? So a similar group in the United States. In 1990, 80% of Americans self-identified as environmentalists. But that's because the word meant something different. When people thought of environmentalism, they didn't think of Greta. They didn't think of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They didn't think of the Green New Deal. They didn't think of Germany being really stupid with its energy policy. Now, that's what people think of. And so it's become polarized, even here and everywhere else around the world. So I think, I think everyone in this room cares about the environment, similar to, I would assume, I don't want to assume, but I will. Americans also, across the spectrum, agree that the environment is worth protecting. Now, it's just at what cost, right? Are we going to completely ruin our economy to protect the environment? Are we going to have socialist policies, communist policies, things that don't help the environment but actually hurt the economy, hurt our country? People are very scared of those policies in the United States. The Green New Deal is very unpopular in the United States because we've actually tried it and it hasn't worked. California has embraced the Green New Deal strategy, and California's energy prices are double the national average in America. They use more oil and gas than they did before, even though they've banned it in their state. And they import the oil and gas now from Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, and Iran. Those aren't exactly America's best friends. So we have seen California not only raise its energy prices, but also not make any progress on reducing carbon emissions or protecting the environment. They've shut down nuclear like California did, and now I live in a state, Arizona, which is near California, and in U.S. terms, it's near California, and in Europe terms, it's not near California at all. But I live in Arizona, and we ship 20% of our nuclear power to California every day. And I went to a coal plant in Utah, which is also pretty far from California, and they ship 80% of their coal power to California every day. So it's a really problematic approach that has not worked because, like I said, it's a loser in terms of the environment, and it's also a loser in terms of the fact that it raises people's energy prices. So I think this is all to say that people are just sick of the environment being caught up in political culture wars. People just want to be able to protect the places that they love hiking, running, skiing, recreating, and even if it's just a local park, they want to be able to protect those places, but they don't want to ruin everyone's life to do it. And I think that that's really where the disconnect has been. There are more I'd say there's equal amount of skeptics as there are with alarmists in the United States. And I would say there's about 80% who don't fall into either of those. So we've got a real opportunity to build a political bridge in America with that 80% to forge a new environmental movement that I talk about in the book that is much more rational and also improves people's lives so that everyone in this room and everyone in America's rooms can want to say that they're environmentalists again.
So the division that everyone can experience, I think not only in the USA but in most of the developed world around climate, can be based on many different factors such as location. Like a Californian will not think the same way of the environment as a person from Nebraska or Florida or places like that. But also one of the strongest divisive force that you keep mentioning in your book is the urban-rural opposition. And these people have very different lifestyles, opportunities, and interests. So whose responsibility do you think is the strongest in making these two people groups, large people groups, more cooperative and less hostile towards each other to find more ground to agree on and less to fight on, especially in relation to climate change and the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell this story, which I tell in the book, which is that I lived in Seattle for 6 years. And Seattle, if you know anything about the United States, is the far upper left corner, but it's also the far left on the political spectrum, too. It's far left. Yeah, they have shirts that say far upper left USA, and it makes so much sense for what the politics are there. So I lived there for 6 years, and it was when I was 18 and until I was 24. And I actually ended up moving because of how bad the politics were. But when you're there, I would tell people that I was from Wisconsin, which is where I grew up. And Wisconsin's in the Midwest. It's farm country. It's if you've ever seen How I Met Your Mother or that 70s show, it's the cheesehead people. That was me growing up. And it's where almost all of America's dairy comes from. And people would tell me, how the heck did you live there? It must have been horrible. Those people are so weird, you know. And they're telling that to me as someone who grew up there. And it was truly, like, people in America talked about coastal elites, right? Like New York, San Francisco, Seattle, looking down on the middle of America, and it is totally true. And what they don't realize is that America gets its resources, its livelihood from those areas. I mean, like I said, the dairy comes from Wisconsin. The energy comes from Texas and other places. The forestry comes from states like Idaho and Montana. Like, all these resources come from the middle of America, yet they are completely looked down upon by these people who use them every single day. So I think that's also where a lot of this conversation has gone wrong, because you have John Kerry in America or Al Gore or some of these prominent politicians flying private jets around the world and then telling people in middle America to not be able to drive their truck, and it just comes across as super disingenuous and really hypocritical. And so I think urban America, and probably true in Europe as well, I would assume, is that I think urban America and the world has to do a better job of understanding how important rural communities are, and that they're not all just stupid, weird people like they think. And in America, at least, that is what they think. But I also think urban areas provide a lot of things that rural areas might not appreciate too. You know, when I go back home to Wisconsin, I say that I lived in Seattle, and I kind of get the same response on the opposite side of, like, those people are all crazy, you must have felt unsafe every single day, and none of that stuff is true either. So I think that when you look at the climate concern, the pollution comes from the urban areas, but it's using the resources from the rural areas. So we have to work together to solve this problem. And the people in rural areas live the closest to the natural environment, so they have the best understanding of the natural environment, so we have to tap into that. And the urban areas have technologies that the rural areas could use. There's ways to make farming more sustainable that actually helps reduce emissions and help the farmers produce more crops. There's ways to manage forest fires in the United States to not have all these areas burn, and that could be using new technology from the urban areas. So there's a lot of collaboration that can happen between these areas when we stop talking past each other and start talking to each other.
But these opposing interests are there deep within so many individual Americans that it's very hard to say who's to solve the problem, who's to start that conversation, who's to make that gap within this group less wide. So whose responsibility mainly is that for you? Is it politicians, NGOs, businesses, or individuals, social organizations?
Yeah, so actually I don't know, I think the responsibility, I feel like it's largely on a whole host of leaders to show the example. Because obviously if you're living in rural Wisconsin, you don't have a lot of, we were actually just talking about this right before getting on stage, a lot of people in the United States have never left their state or their community. Partially that's economic, and part of it's like a comfort thing in America. So it's you can't really put the responsibility on these people who don't talk to each other. Like most people that I know in rural areas have never met somebody from a urban area, and vice versa. It's actually pretty remarkable. So I would say that the responsibility is on the politicians who do know each other, and the celebrities and the influential people who come from all over to show that this is possible again. Because that's what used to happen. They used to team up with each other publicly and actually work with each other in front of Americans. And so I'm launching a new initiative in America in the next 3 months called Nature is Nonpartisan. And we're going to have everyone from Chris Pratt and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jane Goodall and some of the biggest hunting and fishing leaders in the United States all saying a lot of the same things and having collaboration and showing America that this is possible. But until leaders do that, I'm not sure it's going to happen. And I actually think it's going to become worse. Because in America, we've got Fox News and MSNBC and these news outlets that are constantly making the problem worse because they're spreading so much division. I mean, Fox News only cares about Fox News. MSNBC only cares about MSNBC. They don't care about the people. They care about themselves and profit. And what drives profit is the ability to divide people. It's the ability, it's telling people that things suck and getting them to click on it. If I see a headline about a soccer team, football team fighting each other, I'm more likely to click on that than I am to click on something that says, look at the way that these two teams respected each other, right? So the news media has an incentive to divide us. So I'm not going to change the world through news. I'm going to change it through thought leadership and real people trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. And big, influential leaders can help do that and kind of get around the news.
So essentially, not hating rural people and not hating urban people needs a good marketing strategy.
Yeah. You are basically an AI bot. You just perfectly summarized it.
So we've been through energy policies to some extent, but I'd like to elaborate on that a bit more. You're pro-energy efficiency and against energy poverty, and of course you also believe, at least that's what you write in your book, that the emissions of the energy sector should be decreased, not by all costs, but they should be decreased. So where do you see the role of fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and renewables in the future's energy production that is sustainable but also affordable and available for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm all of the above. So we can't be picking winners and losers in the energy space. Germany tried that, didn't work, obviously. California tried that, it didn't work, obviously. New York tried that, it didn't work. When New York shut down its nuclear plant, because it shut down its nuclear plant, which is the dumbest thing you could possibly do, they increased their emissions by 50%. So they closed it down, and environmental groups closed it down because they said that it was bad for the environment. But then emissions went up 50% when they shut it down. So it's a real challenge when you start picking winners and losers, things actually start backfiring. Germany, for example, uses more fossil fuels than it did before as well, but now it's just getting them from other countries, and those countries don't have environmental standards at all. So I think we have to be smart and pragmatic about energy policy in a way that we haven't been. I'm pro-wind, I'm pro-solar, I'm pro-nuclear, I'm pro-natural gas, I'm pro-coal if it if it serves the purpose of providing power to people in a low-cost way and there's no other option. I think coal is going away, but I think it will be here for the foreseeable future as well. So we have to be honest about the fact that we're not just trying to decrease carbon emissions and protect the environment. We also need to provide life for humanity, and energy provides life for humanity. So in the United States, I think we've done a good job of reducing emissions. Over the last 20 years, we've reduced emissions more than any other country, but it's not because of solar and wind. It's because we changed from coal to natural gas. And of course, nuclear has been a big part of that too. American natural gas, because of our technology, has half of the emissions that Russian natural gas does. So technology can play a big role in lowering carbon emissions while providing the same product, right? We're still using natural gas, but it uses half the emissions per unit of energy produced. So we're pro whatever it takes to get us to a place where energy prices are low and that we're reducing carbon emissions. I'm very excited about nuclear energy. The most pro-environmental thing you can do is support nuclear energy. I think countries like Italy and other countries that have banned nuclear need to very much reevaluate that strategy. California banned nuclear, and now it's completely undone it, and they're open to building new reactors in California. So it's starting to change. And then you have people on both political sides in the United States, whether that be Elon Musk or the new Department of Energy Secretary for Trump, or Bill Gates, who are all investing in next-generation nuclear, so these smaller nuclear reactors. And you could have one in your backyard, and I will be the first one to have one in my backyard. Maybe not the first one, I'm not that rich, but maybe the 1,000th.
Yeah. So the next question is good for you because you can market yourself a little bit, and good for us because we can show just how influential of a guest we have here. So you're writing Donald Trump's environmental policy currently. And I'd like to know what relationship, if that's the case, what personal relationship you've got with the next president, and how exactly do you see yourself being able to influence his environmental policy in the future, taking into consideration that you've also, in your book, you've criticized his climate denier tweets, and how badly does he take things like that, criticism? How will you be able to influence his environmental policy?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and first I just want to make it clear that I'm helping write this policy with a lot of other allies in the United States, obviously, but I got a couple calls from top allies of his after, including some of the new administrative selections for the next administration, who said, hey, Benji, we're going to be undoing a lot of things environmentally that Joe Biden did wrong. What can we have as an offensive, better strategy to say, we don't like this, but we do like this? So it's not a guarantee that he will accept it, but we are working with some of his top allies to make it happen, and I'm hoping to get a meeting with him in early January. That's currently being scheduled. So we have an opportunity here to write basically the 21st century example of Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt obviously created the national parks. What I would love to do is have Donald Trump show that nature and conservation are not political. What he has an opportunity to do is say, hey, we're going to invest in our national parks again, because our national parks, I know they look great on postcards on TV and social media, but they actually are $23 billion in debt. So funding our national parks for the next century would be a huge win. 10% of our emissions come from forest fires every summer. Almost all that is preventable. We don't have to have these forest fires. It's really bad forest management. We could invest in fixing that. America obviously is very good at farming and agriculture, but there are some really great sustainable agriculture techniques that we could incentivize farmers to do. There's basically an entire nature investment that Donald Trump, we're going to be pitching him on. And he could be the 21st century Teddy Roosevelt. And that's what we hope will happen. Now, he's skeptical of these issues because of the way that I just described earlier. He's seen the Gretas of the world and the AOCs of the world, and he sees that this issue is a wolf in sheep's clothing, is what the term is. Looks like a sheep, but it's really a wolf inside. And that's kind of what America on the right thinks of environmental issues. And that's why he's had these tweets that say, climate change is just a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese. And I think to change that, we can help show him that Americans love investing in nature and the environment. So we're putting that strategy together right now. But the really cool part about it is that we're coalescing some of the biggest hunting and fishing groups, which tend to be more conservative. And we're also coalescing some of the biggest hiking, skiing, outdoor recreation groups, which tend to be more liberal. And they want the same things. And they didn't realize it until we put them all together. So Donald Trump has a chance to kind of put this coalition to use and deploy a strategy that would put billions of dollars into America's nature. It would reduce carbon emissions, and it would protect the American beauty that so many people come to see, and it's such a big part of our country's heritage. Our legacy in America isn't just the fact that we produce technology and innovation. When people come to the United States, they don't say, oh, I loved that technology that New York had. They say they love the national parks. So we have a duty to protect it. We have a moral obligation to protect it, and we're aiming to get Donald Trump to get behind that. And hopefully in the next couple months, he will unveil that strategy with us. He is very open to working with people who criticize him. And I think that maybe that wasn't always true, but it is now, and I think it's proved to be a benefit to him. Elon Musk tweeted about how much he hated Donald Trump years ago. And, Robert F. Kennedy did the same thing. A lot of the allies that he has around, Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders. We have a lot of people around Donald Trump who, for better or for worse, have disagreed with him substantially. It's not even like me mentioning a tweet in the book is just little tiny pennies compared to what these people have done. And he's open to working with them. So that's why I think there's an opportunity on the environmental side, because I think he'd even be willing to work with environmental groups that said that they didn't like him before. In his first administration, even, he passed a funding of national parks that helped with about $10 billion of a deficit at the time, and he had some of the biggest liberal groups applauding him for that. So we're trying to show him that that's possible here, and I think it's really valuable to have a politician who's willing to work with people who have hated him in the past, because you need to represent everyone, to represent the majority of the country, you need to work with the majority of the country. And if you only work with your own side, then you piss more and more people off, and you start alienating everybody else, and then you start to stop representing them, and the policies don't represent them either.
Do you think the fact that he can't run for president one more time, so this will be his last presidential office, it could help him be more willing to create something durable, something for future generations that he's been more reluctant to do in his previous years when he could run for president one more time. So the fact that he will no longer be president, could this motivate him to do something right, even without possible political gains?
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard is that Donald Trump really cares about right now is cementing his legacy as a positive, voice in American politics. He knows that it was not necessarily seen that way after the 2020 election, and he has an opportunity to do that now. I think that's why he has so many strange bedfellows, as we say in the United States. He's got so many strange bedfellows in terms of the different partners he's bringing in. I wouldn't have had a chance to work with his team in 2016 with the way that he was acting, and I think now he's realizing, he has an opportunity to leave a very positive legacy, and he won't do that by just working with his own little tiny circle. And he looks up to Teddy Roosevelt, for example, and Teddy Roosevelt left a legacy that was remembered for now over 100 years and will be remembered for generations. He wants to be remembered for the same thing. So I think you're going to see him do things that are more about paving a better way for the future, not just right now, but also 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Because I think we can all dream, right, that if you were in that position, you would want to be written about in a positive way in history textbooks, right? He has an opportunity to do that, and he realizes that. And I think that's why we can get something done in the environment.
So very different factors play a part in a person's decision on what party to choose in elections. That's very different in America, in European countries. But do you think the climate and the environment is an important political issue for American people? So as far as I could tell, neither Kamala Harris nor Donald Trump had too much to say on climate and the environment during their election campaign. So is it still something with an important political message, or did it become more marginal compared to previous election?
Yeah, it definitely became more marginal compared to the previous elections. It was a top 3 issue for every young person in previous years, but it was not this time around. And I think it's partially because to care about climate change, which is a real problem, but it's a long-term problem, you have to have all your other needs met. Like, you have to be able to, if you can afford food at the grocery store and you can have good health care and and you're not worried about illegal immigration and you're not worried about gun crime in the cities and you're not worried about these things, then you can start to worry about longer term issues like climate change. America has really struggled over the last 4 to 8 years in a way that we haven't seen in many decades. And for me, even as a climate environmental activist, it wasn't the number one issue for me. So I think it really is obvious that we have to tackle this challenge, but there's also more pressing issues on a lot of people's minds, and we have to be okay with acknowledging that. It still is a determining factor for young people, though, and that's what we tell politicians. Just because it was not the number one issue this election doesn't mean that it won't be again in the future. And if only one side is associated with protection of that, even if they do it the wrong way, as we've talked about, people start to gravitate towards that. It's like if someone, in America we had like the Obama had his healthcare policy. Every Republican went against that over and over again, but they didn't have an alternative. And so then when push came to shove, people voted for Obamacare because it was the only option. And what we tell politicians in America is that, you're going to get the Green New Deal mentality if you don't provide an alternative. So it might not be the number one issue, but it's still very important to have a stance on. And America needs to lead the world in a lot of these things, because we know China's not going to, and we know India is not going to, and those are the 2 most emitting countries in the world. And so the way to get progress is for America to be collaborative. And so it's a political issue not only in the United States that needs to be solved, but it's also internationally very important. And I think that the next few years we'll hopefully be getting our own house in order, our own country in order, so that when people are starting to worry about climate change, it means that America's actually doing pretty well because we have other needs being met. But until those are met, it's not going to be a top priority.
In Conservative Environmentalist, you mention multiple positive and multiple negative examples from modern history in terms of green policies. And one of the positive examples you mention is that of, I think, a Tennessee senator who made some nice progress on the ban, or at least the decrease of ozone layer harming substances. And you mentioned this as a positive example because he forced innovation through expecting businesses to cut their ozone layer depleting activities further than current technologies enable. So if this is a positive example for you, isn't that a bit controversial with the fact that you don't like forced greenings, for example, in Europe, or forced electric car production, forced sun energy or wind energy production? So nowadays this is happening in many parts in Europe and California too. We're trying to green our economies further than technologies allow. But back then with the ozone layer, it was a positive example. So how do you see this controversy?
Well, I think in general, it's a great question. I think setting standards is important, especially if those standards are reasonable, though. And sometimes it's very obvious that it's not reasonable to do something. To cut ozone layer emissions, it was very possible that technology could do it. It's just that they had to accelerate the development of that technology, and also the world was like really going to struggle if the ozone issue did not get fixed. So I'm glad that they set those standards, but A, was a little bit more dire, and B, that it was very obvious that the standards could be met if people prioritized it more. To force things down people's throat, like telling them to stop buying regular vehicles and change to electric, that's not reasonable because, 1, we don't have the supply for that around the world. 2, it's very expensive unless you get it from a place like China, and China is pumping them out at max speed. but they're doing so at the harm of the environment and also using slave labor and doing a lot of really bad things to get those materials. And of course, America does not want to partner up with China on that effort. So, we have to be rational about it. Like, the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, as we can tell right now, or even 12 hours ago. The wind does not blow 24 hours a day. And if the technology can't get us to a place where we can store energy, which we've tried for decades, then trying to say we 100% are only going to be wind and solar is going to fail. And if we're going to say that people have to buy a new vehicle or they have to get rid of their stoves or whatever, especially at the individual level, when you're expecting people to make those choices and it's usually the elites who can actually pay for it to do it, it's going to fail. So I think there's a difference between unreasonable standards and reasonable standards. And there's also a difference between unreasonable standards that just rise costs for people and that actually decrease innovation because people don't want to abide by those standards. And then there's also standards that actually increase innovation to say, we're going to incentivize this rather than punish it. I believe in incentives more than I do in punishments and regulations because you want to create a marketplace. A good example of this is in Japan, they set up a marketplace where there was obviously demand for lower emissions vehicles, but largely because people just wanted to save money at the gas tank and not have to fill up as much. That resulted in the Prius, but they didn't mandate it. They didn't say Toyota, come up with the most fuel efficient car you can. It needs to be 40 miles per gallon or whatever that is in kilometers, and otherwise we're going to punish you. They didn't say that. They said we're going to incentivize you to do this, and if you find a solution, great, you'll be rewarded. But if you don't, it's okay. And look how much the Prius basically catalyzed the entire automobile marketplace. I don't even know if we would have electric vehicles in the way that we do without the Prius. It really just started a whole wave of a positive movement there. So I think there's a difference between positive standards and negative standards. It's very nuanced. It gets very complicated very quickly. But I think when in question, the government setting a really top-down regulation should be the last resort instead of the first resort. And I worry that too many environmentalists see the environmental issues as a way to increase the size of government without thinking about the ramifications of that, and they don't think about what trade-offs or negatives those decisions could bring. What I would love to see, and I think what the world needs to see, is that we look at, can the local government handle this? No. Okay, then can the state or regional government handle this? No. Okay, then go to the federal government. Can incentives help? Okay, no, then go to regulation instead of constantly going to regulations first. And I call that leaning on innovation first rather than leaning on regulation first.
Well, criticism on top-down regulations opposed to more local solutions. I could agree with that, but also in the case of the ozone layer, the fact that there's a very urgent deadline to stop emitting those depleting substances was quite important because people were getting cancer because of ultraviolet radiation. So the deadline that is there, that is imposing, and also a top-down regulation that bans the emission of ozone-depleting substances is part what made it so efficient, in my opinion, in protecting the ozone layer. So if acting on the climate becomes more and more urgent, which it's expected to be, don't you think that top-down regulations and bans and strict measures will also become more and more relevant?
I think that that's the exception to the rule in terms of top-down government regulation working. I think, like I expressed in the book, there are examples of it, and I think that in the future there could be examples where it does work, but I don't think that that is the rule. I think that occasionally a top-down regulation does better than incentives or innovation, but in general it's not true. I would say that when you look at the history of the world, the best solutions have not come from the government honing down on people and telling them what to do. It's come from grassroots, or it's come from capitalism or innovations. Again, I think you can just look at which country. So the countries that are decreasing the emissions the most in the world are actually the countries that are growing their economies the fastest. So I think that correlation is very obvious. That the more technology you have, the more GDP you have, the more economic growth you have, the more that you can invest in lowering emissions. If it's a top-down government like China or Venezuela or whatever, those countries, or a top-down government like in a lesser way, California, it ends up actually increasing carbon emissions even if the intentions are often good. So I think that there are examples of the government regulating things that are good. It's way more nuanced than saying all regulations are bad. But I do think that the environmentalists' call to decrease emissions with just regulations has already failed. It's already shown itself to have failed. And if we want to get to a solution on climate change, we have to keep innovating because we don't have all the solutions. We don't have battery storage for wind and solar. We don't have next generation nuclear yet. We don't have lower emissions natural gas in the way that we would need. We don't have geothermal at the scale that we need. We do not have the solutions on energy. Electric vehicles are not the end all be all. They're not the silver bullet or the only way forward. So we have to keep innovating, and the government saying you have to do this, you have to do that, has already backfired, and I think it will continue to. But that doesn't mean that the government doesn't have a role.
So we've discussed your personal role in the USA's future environmental policies. But what's the role of the youth in general? So not just individual young people, but the youth in shaping the future's climate and environmental policies. And in that, I'm not really curious about responsibilities that are general, so things that everyone should do and therefore also young people should do. I'm more curious about responsibilities that young people could take more efficiently, more effectively, and could be better at completing.
Yeah, I mean, I do think young people have largely gotten activism around climate wrong. I don't think this room strikes me as this group that I'm about to talk about. But the gluing yourself to buildings and standing in front of traffic and that sort of stuff does not actually move the needle in terms of solving these challenges. It actually pushes people further away. I don't think Greta has necessarily helped the cause, and I think that sort of approach has not helped. But the good news is. Well, the bad news is that we have to solve this problem because it's our livelihoods and we have decades left, hopefully 70 plus years to figure this out and help figure it out. But I think young people have basically been told, well, if you don't think the world's ending tomorrow and you aren't going to protest in that way, that you're not taking this issue seriously. And I would say that's not true at all. Young people are needed to be entrepreneurs, to go out there and start businesses that help solve these problems. The United States is putting in trillions of dollars into companies that are solving this problem. Like Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, his widow, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, they're spending billions individually, tens of billions individually to fund startup companies in this space. There's so much money to be made in this, but there's also a lot of difference that can be made. Politicians need better environmental policy advisors. Nonprofits need better environmental policy people too. So I think that what I would say the best thing a young person can do, and the reason I mention the money is because we also, young people want to be able to survive, right? We want to be able to pay our bills and go to the grocery store. We want to be able to do all those things. We should be dedicating our careers to solving this challenge, but in a way that helps solve the problem. And I think whether you're a business major or an engineer or a policy person, you can dedicate your career to solving environmental and climate challenges, but also make money from it too. And I think that that's the future. It's not you have to live paycheck to paycheck and then go and protest. I think that you can dedicate your career to solving this challenge in a way that's unique to whatever you're interested in. And if you can't, right, you don't end up in a career like that. I think that there are more productive ways. Like in America, at least, politicians, it's supposed to be a democratic republic where people hear from their voters, but no voters ever reach out. And so reaching out in a respectful way, saying, hey, here's what we want you to tackle. It's a very important issue to me, and here are some ideas that I have for you. That would actually go a long way. And I've had members of Congress say that they would have voted differently or introduced bills differently if young people actually reached out like that. That's much more productive than going in there and telling them to screw off. For example, actually a good example of this is when I testified at Congress with Greta in 2019. She was all the cameras. It's like if you and I were right next to each other, and all the cameras were over here with their, it was all on you, Greta, you're Greta, and nobody was paying attention to me, which is fine. But all the members of Congress started asking her questions. She couldn't answer them. So they started asking me questions, and then we started actually having a conversation about policy in a way that actually meant something. And then it turned out that there were like 20 questions, and 15 of them went to me, and only 5 went to Greta, because they actually want to have a conversation about how to solve this problem. So I think if you can't dedicate your career to it, having leaders understand ideas that you have or priorities you have in a respectful way goes a long way to having them make the right decisions.
Okay, before my next question, I would like to remind you that you can also ask your questions using the code on the screen, and feel free to do so because I think we're more than happy to answer them. So my next question is going to a bit more global perspective from the US. It's a nice effort that many developed countries are making a good progress in decreasing their carbon emissions. But there are also hundreds of millions of people born within the next few decades in developing countries who would also like a middle-class life for themselves with middle-class consumption. And consumption is what drives emissions nowadays. Some say it could be differently, but right now consumption does drive emissions. So what could the message of the developed world be to developing countries who would like to increase, who would like to develop their lifestyle, and that's opposing our interests of trying to decrease global emissions?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, America or no country should ever say that India or China can't use different technologies that we used to become prosperous. And I don't think any developing country should be able to say that to, or any developed country should be able to say that to a developing country. They need to do what they need to do to become profitable, prosperous, healthy, and up to the same, place that us developed countries are. I totally understand that, and I think that we have to be aware of that. However, there's a lot of technologies in this space that actually decrease costs for people. So the developing world chooses dirtier technologies because it's cheaper. So the only way to help them not do that is to make the cleaner options cheaper than the dirty options. That's the basic economics. And so we don't have that all figured out yet. EVs are more expensive than internal combustion engines by far. They're more expensive. Sorry, EVs are more expensive than internal combustion engines by far. Coal and dirtier energies are more expensive. Cheaper. They're also cheaper. So that's why they're choosing these things, okay? But until if small nuclear reactors become cheaper, they will use them. If solar and wind become cheaper, they will use them. And so that's the role of technology and innovation, is to decrease the costs and decrease the barriers for people to use cleaner technologies. So especially America, we have an obligation, I think. We have a lot of resources in America. Like I said, trillions of dollars are being put into this by American companies. And it's not just to other American companies. We're also helping companies around the world. But we have an obligation to come up with those technologies to help export those to the rest of the world and help developing countries develop even faster by being clean. And until we can prove that, then it's going to be impossible to get developing countries to decrease emissions. And we shouldn't expect them to unless we give them a better option.
Thank you very much for answering my questions. And now I'd like to give the opportunity for the audience questions as well that are here for me. So one of the questions from the audience was, what made American people vote for Trump? What made more of them vote for Trump in 2024 than in 2016 or 2020? So why are there millions more people choosing Trump instead of the Democrats runner-up?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I know personally a decent amount of those people, and who voted for maybe Joe Biden the first time, second time, and then Hillary Clinton the first time. First of all, I think their policies just have not worked. America has really struggled over the last 8 years. largely the last 4, things have gotten a lot worse, and a lot of people attribute that to Democratic policies. And Kamala Harris basically went on stage and just said everything's fine and that everything's great, and we're going to keep making it great. And everyone's like at home being like, well, things don't feel very great. And it felt very dismissing. You know, it felt like they were saying that your problems aren't actually real and they don't actually exist, and people got very frustrated by that. Condescending was the word I was going to use, but Kamala came across as very condescending. I also think that Donald Trump's rhetoric changed a little bit. He was a little more optimistic and uplifting. He wasn't just talking about how much the Democrats sucked and coming up with nicknames for everybody that he didn't like. He actually proposed different ideas, and I think people like that, right? They want to feel frustrated, or they want to be acknowledged for being frustrated, but they also want to have like hope and optimism for the future. And Americans finally felt that for the first time. I think with Trump too. I don't think he's really structured a campaign like that in the past. And then I also think people in America are very sick of like elites trying to dominate the election, whether that be like media outlets, famous influencers who have always been a part of the Democratic Party. It's not like they were like coming out new. And he also built a coalition with people that were brand new to his coalition, like Joe Rogan and Elon Musk, who were Bernie Sanders supporters. I mean, that's a big change, right? So he appealed to new people. He acknowledged their frustration, but he also provided a sense of optimism. And Kamala couldn't do any of those things. She didn't attract any of the voters that didn't vote for her boss, Joe Biden, the first time. And she also just basically said, "Your problems don't exist. Everything's great." And that didn't work very well with people, and it didn't work well with me either.
Okay, so the next question from the audience there was on, precise actions of Trump's future environmental policy. So as long as it's not subject to secrecy, and anything you can tell us from your environmental policy that you're writing, what actions precisely do you think will be taken by the Trump administration in the field of the environment?
Great question. I think first off, he's going to probably leave the Paris Accords. I think that's like the big question. He's most likely going to leave that. I don't think anyone really has a say on whether or not he decides to stay in it. He's pretty set, it seems like, on leaving that. What we've said is you can meet the goals of the Paris Accords without being in them, and we did actually the first 4 years. I don't necessarily think I would leave if I was president, but you can still be involved in the international conversations without being in the Paris Accords. And that would be my message to Trump is, if you're going to leave, still stay engaged with the world at large, because they need to hear from us on our strategy. So that's probably going to happen. We probably will expand oil and gas production, which I think would be great from a geopolitical standpoint. I think countries like pretty much everyone in the EU needs that to happen, and I think America can play a better role as an ally on energy because of that. But then on the pro-environmental side, I think we're going to see, like I said, investments in sort of the natural side of things. So more sustainable agriculture, forestry. You're going to see a bigger investment in ecosystem preservation and like protection of different natural ecosystems. And then I think you're going to start to see a huge investment in nuclear and geothermal energy from the president-elect. He appointed the head of the Department of Energy. He appointed a person who's on the board of geothermal and nuclear companies, but he also has an oil and gas company. And so I think you're going to see a combination of all those things. And I think the combination of geothermal, nuclear, and natural gas will help America reduce emissions more than anyone would have dreamed of on the political left. But it's a different approach. And I think a different approach could actually reduce emissions faster. And I'm not sure Donald Trump's number one goal is to reduce emissions. I actually know that's obviously not true. But he does believe that you can reduce emissions and expand energy production. And that should be the goal. And I think we will find success in that over the next 4 years. And I hope countries like Hungary can be a recipient of the benefit of America producing more energy.
Even if you meet your emission reduction standards, don't you think it sends a bad message if the US exits the Paris Agreement, and doesn't that send a bad message to great polluters like India and China, and even smaller countries who struggle to meet their goals? Don't you think it's even if the standards and the goals are met, don't you think it's bad marketing for sustainability?
Yes and no. I mean, I think having our voice at the international table is critical and probably does send a negative message in the short term. But I do think that China and India feel like they can just walk all over the United States in terms of, well, in general, China just thinks it can walk all over everyone. But they're increasing emissions, and yet they're making all these promises that they're not meeting. They are trying to hold America accountable for things that we aren't doing, and we're already reducing emissions, and they think that we should be paying more than they should be. I mean, it's kind of a backwards program, and so I would say it also sends a message to India and China like, hey, we're going to reduce our emissions, and we expect you to do so as well, but we're not going to play the game of, pretending that you guys are perfect and that we have some outsized influence on this. You guys have to start working on things too. We're already working on them, and we're not at the same page right now. So I would say that it's important for us. Again, if I was president, I would stay in the Paris Accords. But if he's going to leave it, I don't think that it's a deal breaker for the climate and environmental space, because I think we're showing that even if we're not a part of an agreement that China and India are not, they're already violating it, that we can also make progress at the same time.
So there was also an interesting question from the audience here. That is, don't you think the USA will have a handicap in foreign investments, especially in developing countries, in climate change-based investment against Russia and China, for example, who have lower ethical and democratic standards when choosing a developing country to invest in?
So can you reword that a little bit? So
what sorts of handicaps you could have, or how can you make these handicaps disappear? How can you not have a worse position than Russia and China when considering these climate-based investments? They don't have certain standards that you do have, and how can you overcome these difficulties?
Well, I think America has to invest more resources into working with African nations, and in helping kind of be a better player in those conversations. We're so much focused on what happens inside of our own borders, and we need to focus more on also how we can help be an allied partner outside of our own borders. And America has ceded Africa to China and Russia. We've allowed the EU to become dependent on Russia because we're like, we only really care about what happens here in the United States. And that's not a very good strategy. So what I'll be pushing for, too, is saying, yes, we have to care about what's in our own borders, but we also need to work with the countries that might need our help. And instead of having China and Russia there, maybe we can be there and work with the EU on that. We should be partnering with all the different countries in Europe to have influence in Africa and other places that are geographically closer to here. So I think it's a big priority that I'm not sure Trump quite understands yet, but it's something that he needs to and maybe can take action on in the next 4 years.
And my last question is a bit of a clickbait one, but I would like to know, what do you expect to be the most important action that the Trump administration takes in the field of the environment and climate in the next 4 years? So if within 50 years there will be only one thing written in history books about Trump's second climate policy and second environmental policy, what do you expect to be the most important point?
I truly believe that in the next 4 years, Donald Trump will make the biggest investment in America's environment of any president in U.S. history. It will be bipartisan, and that it will reduce carbon emissions by about 10% over the next 4 years. I think it will go down as a Teddy Roosevelt-style investment, and I do believe that it will make environmental issues nonpartisan in America again, and I hope, and I will be pushing deeply for that to include a lot of international cooperation as well. But I think America is about to see a sizable investment in its environment, which has been neglected, and Donald Trump is going to prioritize it and be the most surprising person to do it, honestly. I think people will be shocked, but that's exactly why Donald Trump is good at what he does, because he shocks a lot of people with good decisions and sometimes bad ones, but mostly good ones. And I think he's going to do that again here.
Benji, thank you very much for being here with us today and answering our questions. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here with us today. Please follow Klímapolitikai Institute and MCC on our social media platforms.
Thanks, everyone.